Introduction to Jung.
Ready to unlock some of those secrets of your inner world.
Let's do it.
All right. Today, we are diving deep into Jungian psychology.
Oh, exciting.
It is fascinating stuff, and we're using this text called Introduction to Jungian Psychology. Have you read this one?
You know, I've actually had my eye on it for a while. I've heard good things.
Really interesting. Okay, good. So this will be just like a, Psych 101 recap. We're going deep.
Let's go deep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think what people often miss about Jung is how his background, like being Swiss, that blend of, those stunning mountains and the precise clockwork, it's like it echoes throughout his theories. It's easy to kind of pigeonhole him as just, all dreams and archetypes.
Right, right.
But there's this really interesting practicality, I think, that weaves its way throughout.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not all like mystical woo stuff with Jung. He was like very grounded, right? He built his own stone tower at Bollingen.
Exactly.
That's a man who's like, I like the real world.
Totally grounded in the physical world. And I think that's really important because it plays into this concept of the triune brain, which is this idea that our brains aren't just these modern marvels, right? They house these remnants of like our reptilian ancestors alongside these like complex emotional and cognitive systems. So we're hardwired with instincts. And for Jung, that's not something to be ignored, but something to be like integrated.
Okay, so that makes me think of archetypes, which we're going to get into a lot today, because Jung talks about those a lot, those inherited patterns of behavior and even imagery that we're kind of born with. So how does that instinctual layer of the brain, how does that play into these kind of deeper, almost mythic structures within us?
So imagine like a gosling imprinting on Lorenz, like the first being it sees, right?
Right.
That immediate instinctual bond. That's the power of an archetype in action.
Okay.
Except for us, it's less about a single gosling and more about these like universal figures, like think the mother, the hero, the shadow. These big concepts.
So are you saying our brains kind of come preloaded with like software for understanding these archetypal roles? Like it's already in there?
It's more like blueprints, I would say.
Okay.
Predisposing us to certain ways of like experiencing the world.
Okay.
So for example, the mother archetype, it's not just about our actual mothers, right? It influences how we approach nurturing, caregiving, maybe even romantic relationships later in life.
Oh, interesting. That's a great segue into this idea of super kids. These are children who thrive despite incredibly difficult upbringings. Is that maybe an example of archetypes, like providing resilience?
I think so. I think these cases are really interesting because they kind of hint at this deep-seated drive within us, almost like an inner blueprint for like connection, for growth.
Right.
That persists even when you don't have ideal circumstances.
Wow.
There's this fascinating study about identical twins who were separated at birth, and they ended up leading these eerily similar lives, like down to both marrying women named Linda, then divorcing and remarrying women named Betty.
Oh, come on.
So it makes you wonder what's actually pre-programmed, right?
Yeah, that is spooky. Wow. Okay, so we've got these archetypes that are kind of like subtly guiding us. But then there's the shadow, right? This like part of ourselves that we kind of bury deep down. This doesn't sound as positive as the goslings.
So the shadow's not inherently bad. It's often made up of parts of ourselves that don't fit societal expectations.
Okay.
So imagine like a young girl who's really gifted with mechanics.
Okay, yeah.
But her parents, they're worried about her fitting in, so they kind of push her towards these more traditionally feminine pursuits.
Right.
And so she might repress that mechanical inclination. It gets buried in the unconscious.
So she's creating this persona, this like mask almost of who she thinks she should be, but it's like at the cost of her true self.
Yeah, and that's where the trouble can start, right?
Right.
Because she might end up in a career that doesn't feel right, or a relationship and just like feeling incomplete. And she might even lash out at other women who are really assertive, or men who are really emotionally expressive,
Yeah, like that saying, we judge most harshly in others what we fear most in ourselves.
Exactly.
So how do we stop the shadow from kind of like hijacking our lives? Does Jung offer any tools for dealing with these like repressed aspects of ourselves?
He believed dreams were like a direct line to the unconscious.
Okay.
And often the shadow will actually appear in dreams as a figure of the same gender, kind of revealing these hidden truths about ourselves. But this is where it gets even more interesting. Jung introduces the anima and animus. These are archetypes that actually bridge our conscious and collective unconscious.
Okay, hold on. So not only do we have our own personal shadow, but we're also like tapping into this collective unconscious soup of archetypes?
Hmm.
That's a lot.
It's a lot to process.
Yes.
But think of it as like these archetypes, they have this really profound influence on our experiences. So the anima, for men, often appears in dreams as a feminine figure, and it embodies these hidden emotional and intuitive qualities that he might be repressing.
And then I'm guessing for women, it's the animus, right? Like that more assertive, logical aspect that's kind of traditionally associated with masculinity.
Exactly. And a common misconception is that the animus for women only appears as like this vague group of men.
Okay.
The truth is, both men and women typically dream of
Yeah.
like a very distinct, well-defined individual when they encounter the anima or the animus.
So that's what I always get tripped up on. How do we differentiate between encountering a real person and just like projecting our anima or animus onto them, especially when it comes to romantic attraction?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think it's so central to Jung's work. And he proposed that the anima and animus, they're not static. They evolve alongside like the ever-shifting dynamics between men and women in society.
So as our understanding of like masculinity and femininity evolves, these inner archetypes within us evolve too. They kind of mirror those broader cultural shifts.
Yes, exactly. Think about the emergence of like romantic love and chivalry in like the 12th century.
Okay.
Suddenly, there's this new idealized view of women, this concept of courtly love, which is distinct from, purely physical desire.
Right.
It's like something in the collective unconscious shifted, and the anima, that feminine archetype,
Yeah.
takes on this new form.
It's like we're all swimming in this like vast sea of shared imagery and history, and it's like subtly shaping how we see ourselves and each other in the world.
Totally. A great literary example of this is the legend of Parsifal and his quest for the Holy Grail.
Okay, now we're talking about knights and quests and holy grails. This is getting very symbolic.
Just bear with me because I think this ties directly into this idea of the self, which we're going to talk about.
Okay.
So the Grail, it's often seen as a feminine symbol, and it embodies this like missing wholeness that Parsifal, the knight, is seeking, right?
Uh-huh.
It reflects this very human yearning for like something beyond ourselves, for completion, for integration.
Which brings us to the self and how it differs from the ego.
Exactly.
Okay.
The self is our innate potential, that truest version of ourselves that we all like strive toward throughout our lives. It's a lifelong journey of individuation, of becoming whole.
So how does the self actually reveal itself? I mean, does it show up in our dreams too, like the shadow or the animus?
It does, and in some really powerful ways. One really common symbol is the mandala.
Mandalas, like those like intricate circular designs that you see in Buddhist art and stuff.
Precisely. Jung believed that these symmetrical patterns, they represent wholeness, this
Yeah.
integration of the conscious and the unconscious.
Okay.
And he found that they often appeared in dreams during like periods of intense personal growth. And Jung himself actually had a pivotal mandala dream.
Okay, you can't just leave us hanging with that. We're going to have to hear about that. Welcome back, everybody. We are picking up our Jungian journey right where we left off, and that is with a particularly intriguing dream. You mentioned that Jung himself had this mandala dream.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just any dream. This is like a pivotal moment for Jung in his own understanding of like what the self was. So he described it as like a circular island, and there was a square city at its center. And then within that city, there were more squares, there were more circles. And they all kind of culminated in this like castle or a church at the very center. And it was this nested structure, this visual representation of wholeness that really resonated with him.
So it's not always about seeing like literal geometric shapes in dreams. It sounds like the very structure of the dream, the events of the dream can kind of embody these like mandala-like qualities.
Right. Dreams speak in symbols, not plain language,
Yeah.
Like, for example, did you know that the number 3 progressing to 4 within a dream can actually signify the emergence of the self?
No.
Yeah. Jung saw the Christian Trinity as like this incomplete quaternity, like it was lacking that feminine element.
Mm.
So when those symbolic 3s, they give way to 4s in our own dreams, it often suggests a movement towards, wholeness, towards the self.
Okay. Numbers. I'm watching out for numbers. What about animal symbols in dreams? They rarely make sense to me, but they show up. They show up a lot.
It's so true. Jung observed that certain animals consistently show up as representations of the self. So like elephants, horses, white birds, sometimes even snakes and fish. He called them theriomorphic dreams.
Catchy.
And often these dreams, they leave this powerful impression, this feeling of like awe or reverence, even if the content seems bizarre.
So those really strange animal dreams, that might be a positive sign. Like, hey,
Yeah,
you're tapping into this deeper aspect of yourself.
maybe.
Okay. But you've also mentioned that this encounter with the self can be, well, overwhelming and that there are like dangers to this kind of deep inner work. So how do we know if we're getting in over our heads?
Yeah, it's really important to acknowledge that this isn't all sunshine and rainbows. You talked about this thing called the mana personality. And this is someone who has been like flooded by the collective unconscious. They become kind of inflated with a sense of their own importance. It's like they tapped into a wellspring of energy, but they haven't learned how to handle it.
So like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Maybe, yeah. Or in this case, a little bit of the unconscious goes a long way. It's about maintaining humility.
Okay.
This energy, this mana, it's not personal. It belongs to the collective, like, history of humanity. We're just channels for it.
Right. Okay.
And by remembering our own limitations, by staying connected to that shadow side of ourselves, that's how we avoid that trap, that spiritual grandiosity.
It makes you think of those like cautionary tales of people getting lost in these like spiritual pursuits, so focused on their inner world that they completely lose touch with reality. So how do we avoid that?
One way is to actually channel this energy constructively. So Jung was a huge advocate for creative expression. So like writing, painting, music, even just having like meaningful conversations, like these become outlets. It helps us integrate these really powerful forces into our lives rather than just being like swept away.
Okay, yeah.
And it actually kind of makes me think of Maslow's concept of self-actualization.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all learned about that pyramid.
Exactly. But how does self-actualization fit into kind of Jungian thought?
Yeah, how does it?
Well, I think what's often forgotten is that self-actualization, that drive to fulfill our potential, it's not just about personal growth.
Okay.
Maslow believed that it also involves contributing to something larger than ourselves, like using our unique gifts to actually make a positive impact on the world around us.
So it's not just about like retreating into our inner world and navel gazing all the time. It's about taking what we learn from that inner work and actually bringing it out into the world in a meaningful way.
Exactly.
Right.
And that kind of brings us back to this challenge of distinguishing true love from like the projection of our anima or animus onto others.
The age-old dilemma.
Right. How can we ever be sure that we're actually seeing someone for who they are and not just like what we want to see?
Right.
I mean, it's a question that deserves its own deep dive. But for now, I think a key takeaway from this text is that as we integrate our shadow, as we become more conscious of our own animus, we become less prone to these projections.
So doing that inner work, that self-reflection, that better equips us to actually recognize like a genuine connection when it comes along.
Exactly.
Right.
Because it's about becoming more discerning. We're less driven by those like unconscious needs and fantasies. Remember that example from earlier about the journalist who dyed her hair blonde and
then she's like, wait a minute.
all this unwanted attention.
This is not what I signed up for.
And it just highlights how much those unconscious kind of archetypal images were driving behavior.
Yeah.
And it underscores the fact that we're all influenced by these archetypes. Whether we realize it or not, but through understanding them, we can actually start to break free from some of those limited patterns.
Which brings us back to like how the anima and the animus actually evolve over time. Jung saw these archetypes as fluid, right? Not fixed.
Absolutely. They're constantly adapting, mirroring those broader societal shifts in gender roles and relationships.
So as our understanding of masculinity and femininity evolves, those inner archetypes within us are also shifting and changing.
It's a fascinating dance between the personal and the collective. It's what makes Jungian psychology so relevant, even like today. It gives us this framework for navigating the complexities of like human relationships, for understanding those deep currents that kind of shape our desires, our fears, our motivations.
It's like he's given us this map to our own like inner landscape, but it's up to each of us to actually like explore that terrain. We have to confront those shadows, embrace the animus, and ultimately like embark on that quest to discover the self at the heart of it all.
Beautifully said. But this journey of individuation, this process of becoming whole, it doesn't mean striving for perfection. It's about embracing kind of both the light and the shadow within us, understanding that even those seemingly negative qualities actually hold a key to our growth.
Speaking of negative qualities, our source material doesn't shy away from some of the darker manifestations of this shadow in society. I mean, from something like the brutal treatment of British upper class boys and this link to like repressed desires to something as like chilling as the Milgram experiment. How do we even begin to unpack something like that?
Yeah, the Milgram experiment is definitely a tough one. I think it's a stark reminder of how easily we can be swayed by authority, like even to the point of harming others.
It's true.
And it exposes the potential shadow side of, even the scientific pursuit itself, right?
Yeah.
Where that hunger for knowledge can actually eclipse these really important ethical considerations.
That blind obedience to authority, that willingness to inflict harm because someone in a position of power is telling us to. It's a classic manifestation of the shadow, isn't it?
It is, and we see it repeatedly throughout history. I mean, from the Crusades to the Holocaust, entire groups of people demonized and persecuted. It's like we're always searching for somewhere to project our own darkness.
So how do we interrupt that cycle if recognizing like the monster within ourselves is the first step, then what comes next?
I think it's not about condoning those dark impulses, but it's about understanding them. It's about integrating them into our conscious awareness so that we're less likely to act them out in these destructive ways. And our dreams can be incredibly valuable tools in this process because often they show us those shadow qualities in these stark, sometimes unsettling ways that force us to like confront what we might be avoiding in our waking lives.
So instead of like shying away from those more disturbing dreams, we should actually lean in, like try to understand what they're revealing about our shadow selves.
Exactly. And one way to do this is through a technique that Jung developed called active imagination. So this is where you would actually engage with your dream figures, almost like in a dialogue, either in your mind or by writing it down. So you're essentially like stepping into that dream world and having a conversation with your unconscious.
That sounds fascinating and terrifying all at the same time.
It can be both.
Okay.
But the insights gained from it can be really profound because by confronting those shadow figures head on, we actually start to like unravel the deeper meaning behind our dreams. And in doing so, we gain this like invaluable self-knowledge.
It's like this form of inner alchemy, isn't it? Like taking those raw unconscious elements and transforming them into something valuable, something that can like fuel our personal growth.
Exactly. And that gets to like the very heart of Jungian psychology, this understanding that wholeness doesn't equal perfection. It's about embracing all aspects of ourselves, even the ones that we deem negative or unacceptable. It's about finding the gold within the shadow, the wisdom within the wound.
That's beautifully put. But, there's got to be a fine line between embracing our shadow and like becoming completely consumed by it. How do we know if we're headed in the right direction on this path?
That is a crucial question, and one that we're actually going to delve into further in part 3 of our deep dive. So we explore some signs of like healthy integration versus like unhealthy inflation and how to navigate those challenges that inevitably arise on this path of individuation.
Sounds like uncharted territory. We need to map that out carefully. Don't miss the final installment of our Jungian deep dive, where we navigate those treacherous waters and hopefully uncover the secrets to a more authentic and meaningful life. Welcome back to the show, everyone. We are in the final stage of our Jungian deep dive, and wow, we are really navigating some intense terrain here. We've been talking about like embracing our shadow selves, tapping into the energy of the self, all that good stuff. But, how do we find that balance point?
It is a really delicate dance, isn't it? Like,
What?
how do you embrace the shadow without being totally swallowed by it?
Yeah.
And how do we access that like powerful energy of the self without becoming inflated?
Right.
It takes a lot of awareness. It's almost like this inner tightrope walk.
So how do we know if we're on the right path? I mean, what are some like warning signs, maybe of, I don't know, like unhealthy inflation versus healthy integration? How do we tell the difference?
Well, let's start with inflation. Remember, that's when like the unconscious energy kind of overwhelms us. We start believing we have some sort of special knowledge that we're like above everyone else.
It's like we've become this caricature of the archetype, like we've swallowed it whole instead of actually integrating its lessons.
Yes, exactly. And we might become like really preachy, like completely convinced that we have all the answers. We become so focused on these like abstract ideas that we totally neglect the like real world, the actual people around us.
Right.
And Jung himself, he even grappled with this. He actually recognized inflation as like a very natural part of the individuation process.
Okay.
But he really stressed the importance of catching it early,
So how do we do that? How do we stay grounded when we're encountering these like incredibly powerful archetypal forces.
I think humility is absolutely key. We have to remember, like, this energy isn't ours alone. It belongs to this, like, collective human story.
Right.
And we are simply channels for it. It's recognizing our own limitations.
Okay.
Staying connected to that shadow side of ourselves. That's what prevents us from falling into that trap of spiritual grandiosity.
Yeah, it's like we always need to keep one foot firmly planted in reality, even as we're exploring these like really profound like inner depths.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where relationships, both personal and professional, they become so valuable because they provide these really crucial reality checks. People in our lives, they reflect back our strengths and our weaknesses.
Like that example from the text about the computer programmer who actually thrived at like office parties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Here's this classic introvert. But within that very specific, like, social context, he was able to access that more extroverted side of himself.
Right.
He could actually really enjoy himself. And I think it reminds us that, like, we all have these hidden capacities, and often those capacities are awakened in relationship to other people.
So it's like this constant dance, right? Between solitude and connection, like finding that rhythm that allows us to integrate these seemingly opposing parts of ourselves.
Yes, and that dance is lifelong, right?
Yeah.
It requires paying attention to our dreams, to our emotions, to our relationships, and recognizing, like, okay, where am I maybe clinging too tightly? Where am I out of balance?
Constantly making these subtle adjustments, between inflation, deflation, shadow, light, to find that like sweet spot.
And remember, it's not about achieving some sort of static state of perfection. That's not what this wholeness thing is about. It's about embracing that dynamic tension, the ebb and flow of these kind of opposing forces within us. Because wholeness, it encompasses like the light and the shadow, the masculine and the feminine, the rational and the irrational, all of it.
That beautiful concept of the yin and yang.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because that ancient symbol, it just like perfectly illustrates the interconnectedness of what we perceive as opposites.
Yeah.
One can't exist without the other.
Right.
And within each, there's the seed of its opposite.
And a dance, a never-ending dance.
Yeah.
Which actually makes me think about that dream example that we discussed earlier, the one with the mean and ambitious black man who owned the hotel. Are you saying that even those qualities, which we might initially like judge very negatively, that those can actually hold a key to our wholeness?
I think so. When integrated consciously, those what we perceive as negative shadow qualities, they can actually become real sources of strength. So that ambition, it could fuel creative endeavors or leadership or a healthier sense of assertiveness.
Right.
It's about finding the like constructive outlet.
Okay, so it's not about like eradicating these parts of ourselves. It's more about like transforming our relationship to them.
Exactly. Right? And there's a really powerful quote from the text that I wanted to share that I think speaks to this. It says, "What forces us to create a substitute from within ourselves is not an external lack, but our own inability to include anything outside ourselves in our love."
Wow. That really makes you think. It's suggesting that this whole journey, this process of like individuation, it's ultimately about expanding our capacity for love and acceptance, of ourselves, of others, of the world in all of its like messy complexity.
Beautifully said. And I think as we go deeper into Jungian psychology, as we explore these archetypes, we inevitably arrive at this much richer understanding of like interconnectedness.
Yeah.
It's not just about our individual journeys, but how those journeys weave into this larger human tapestry.
Each of us playing our own like unique part in this grand like unfolding of it all. It's a pretty awe-inspiring thought.
It is. And I think as we embrace our own individuality, that unique blend of shadow and light within each of us, that's how we actually contribute to the beauty and diversity of that tapestry. And it's like, it's a never-ending journey of discovery, of growth, of becoming, ever more fully human.
What a powerful note to end on. And on that note, we've reached the end of our Jungian deep dive. But really, this is just the beginning, isn't it?
It is. Keep exploring, keep dreaming, keep questioning, and keep becoming the most authentic versions of yourselves. Remember, if seemingly negative traits like meanness can hold a key to our wholeness, what might your shadow be trying to tell you? That's something to ponder as you continue your own unique journey of individuation.
And there you have it, folks. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey into the depths of Jungian psychology. Make sure you check back with us soon for another deep dive.